Hello and welcome to The Best Ever, a unique wrestling analysis podcast from Pro Wrestling Musings, looking at some of the best ever wrestling matches through the eyes of some of the best ever wrestling fans. I'm Craig from Pro Wrestling Musings, and today I'm delighted to be joined by our usual podcast host, Griff from GA. Griff, how are you doing today, sitting on the other side of the table this time?
It's unique, and I'm doing great because we get to talk about this match, which I absolutely love. So, I couldn't be having a better day.
So this match that Griff has just referenced, if you haven't yet read the title of the podcast episode, and you probably should, is The Rock versus Brock Lesnar from SummerSlam 2002. An interesting pick for the best ever. So, Griff, just to help listeners along if they exclusively listen to this podcast on our network, who are you and how did you end up talking to me about this?
Well, that's a very interesting question, but I will give you the brief version because I do think I have a different story than pretty much all the people that you've been talking to on the best ever. So I come from a broadcasting and journalism background. It's and I've loved sports my entire life. So that's what I have been doing. And when I left university, that's what I was doing for a living. And I had no interest in wrestling at all. I had never been into it. In fact, I was that guy that said, "Oh, it's fake, right?" I was that guy. And then when I was about 19, there was a flash sale for the WWE 2K video game. And I was like, all right, I don't know, it's like $10. I'll try it, whatever. And in my trying to figure out what all the terminology was for that video game, I just got sucked in. I realized every single thing I researched, every part of it, I was like, man, I actually really like this. I started to open my mind a little bit. The first match I ever watched, and it's kind of interesting that that's not the match I picked for this, but you'll find out why in a second. The first match I ever watched was Daniel Bryan versus Batista versus Randy Orton at WrestleMania 30.
Oh, really?
Yes. That was the first match I ever saw. And I was like, man, and I saw it without commentary, which I later figured out was actually the key for why I liked it so much. But I was like, man, I got to try this. And then I actually met a professional wrestler that I was working with. I talked to him about it.
But if you listen to it without commentary, how did you enjoy it without somebody explaining every single thing every step of the way?
So it's interesting. I think
you don't need to take that seriously.
Okay, I thought you were being serious. No, I mean, I did the same thing with soccer too, where I didn't know anything about the sport and then I just watched it and started to learn more about it. I actually think watching without commentary sort of helps. Just in terms of getting to experience what's going on, and I didn't need to know the move names or anything at the time. But as I went more and more into it, I started to love it more and more. And then when it came to Pro Wrestling Musings, I actually saw when AEW used a PWM graphic during a match, and I can't remember exactly what match it was.
Jake Hager versus
Mox
on the first night of Fyter Fest last year.
That's the one. I saw it. I was like, wow, this is something different because it blends my background working in sports and my passion for wrestling. And so I emailed Craig, and here we are a year later.
There we are.
Yeah.
Cool. Brilliant. So what are your sort of current projects around kind of wrestling content stuff?
Well, when it comes to Pro Wrestling Musings, obviously we do the Pro Wrestling Musings podcast. We do that every week. We do special episodes as well, talking about various topics, and those are always happening. I work on the Pro Wrestling Musings YouTube channel, and we have some really, really cool and interesting videos that are always going up there, analyzing stats, analyzing stories, the kind of thing that we love as wrestling nerds. And then on my own time, where you introduced me as Griff from GA, so the GA part actually stands for General Admission. On my own time, I run two different YouTube channels, General Admission Sports and General Admission Wrestling, where I actually do a WWE 2K Universe mode, which is a very interesting one. And I have a lot of fun with that because I work in TV. So I basically just get to produce TV shows for that channel. So I do a
Very
lot of
cool.
wrestling every day. And on top of that, we watch wrestling, obviously.
Obviously,
I
yes.
do find time to watch it.
That does help talking about it. So the big question, you've chosen The Rock versus Brock Lesnar. Now, obviously, this match doesn't come up too often when you're talking about what's the best of all time. You hear Okada, Danielson, Undertaker, Punk, all these names are thrown around. The Rock and Brock Lesnar isn't one that I've ever heard in that conversation before. Why have you chosen this one exactly?
So this one I think is very underappreciated, I think for several different reasons. One, it's not a match that you would generally consider in its flow to be the best ever, and we'll get into this when we start talking about it. But it is very methodical at times, and when you think of best matches ever, you're thinking of action constantly. That's oftentimes what comes up, and this match at times doesn't feel like that. So I think that's one reason. I think another reason is the way Brock Lesnar has been booked since he returned to WWE has kind of made people forget how great he was when he started, right? I mean, there was a reason why Brock Lesnar was considered such a superstar, and I think this match just perfectly encapsulates everything about why Brock Lesnar was considered the superstar that he was from very early on. And I think the other reason is there are so many tropes in wrestling when it comes to how people sell, how the fans react to wrestlers. We talk about the passing the torch moment. All of these tropes, you see them in a lot of ways either get embodied in their most perfect form or get started in this match. And we'll get into it. But all of those things that we talk about when it comes to wrestling at a very high level, executing at the highest level in pro wrestling, a lot of that came from this match. And I think a lot of people just kind of they don't think about it for all the reasons that I previously mentioned. But hopefully throughout talking about it, I can go back, first of all, get you to go rewatch that match and also look at it from a different perspective and think, wow, there's a lot of stuff here that I didn't really notice through my first time, but it's influenced a lot of things that we see in wrestling.
Okay, that's very cool. So I'm going to have a quick run through the lead up to this match, and then you can jump in with anything that I may have missed out or anything that you think is particularly important to bring up as well.
Okay, perfect.
So it's a very good place to start with when Lesnar joined the WWE, which was in the year 2000. And he debuted on Raw a couple of years later, the 18th of March 2002. This match that we're talking about today took place on SummerSlam, the 25th of August 2002. Those dates are correct. They are 5 months apart. To get there, Brock Lesnar won the King of the Ring to gain the opportunity. He was spoken about as a rookie at this time. The Rock had to face off against The Undertaker and Kurt Angle to make it to this match as he defended the title in a triple threat. Brock Lesnar semi-famously bloodied Hulk Hogan en route to this match with a kind of brutal-looking bear hug that does factor into this match. Griff, is there anything that you think I've missed out or is important for listeners to have in their mind in regards to this?
The only thing I can add is the last high-profile pay-per-view match that Brock had coming into this was the King of the Ring finals against Rob Van Dam, and that was I didn't pick that match. It was a great match, but it was much different than this one. So if you want to watch this, if you have the time, go back and watch his match versus RVD because it was much different, and you'll see why that plays into why I think the way I do about Brock Lesnar.
Okay, sounds good. So in this match, it's really, really interesting to analyze how The Rock is received by the crowd. He does seem to get cheered as he comes out. The Rock does that really cool thing that they do during the Attitude Era where he rushes the ring and attacks Brock Lesnar immediately, who immediately, very on brand for Brock Lesnar, responds with a German suplex. And we do actually start to get some Rocky sucks chants. Then there's a bunch more suplexes from The Rock. From Brock Lesnar.
The Brock.
So it's kind of that, to begin with, it's kind of that John Cena match template. Brock Lesnar's done 4 grapples by the second minute, which is quite a lot. Grapples are quite spaced out in wrestling matches. One of the first things I noticed when I started doing this is how much wrestling matches actually just revolve around strikes being exchanged, and everything else is just kind of littered in here and there.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In this match, you're talking about a combined 64 strikes, but in just under 16 minutes, these two combined at the same time for 13 grapples. So I mean, almost, and that is very typical, especially of matches between these two guys.
Brilliant.
Or with these two guys, I should say.
Yeah, and those amount of grapples, 13 in 16 minutes, is actually quite a lot, and grapples do tend to be a theme of this match. So as we go along, Paul Heyman starts getting involved, which is interesting. Brock Lesnar being presented as the immovable force, immovable object, whatever you want to call it. He's a heel, so he does still have a heel manager. Heyman is involved 3 times by the 3rd minute, and it's the 4th minute before The Rock does anything that's not just a simple strike. So he gets a few little strikes in here and there, but it takes him 4 minutes before he can hit a grapple on Brock Lesnar. There's a cool double kip-up spot. Then they do that kind of can't knock him down spot where The Rock is hitting Lesnar again and again and again. Eventually Rock does it, and the crowd do cheer The Rock here. And then there's a whole minute of the sharpshooter, and during this you can hear the crowd shouting, "Let's go Lesnar," which is interesting. I did find the way that the crowd received these two men very interesting throughout this. I want to watched. Yeah, go for it. Just jump in.
I want to talk about this this sell of the sharpshooter as well. So on the Pro Wrestling Musings podcast, after the episode of AEW Dynamite where MJF beat Chris Jericho, one of the things that I really keyed into in that match was the way Jericho was selling submissions. And that from moment one, Jericho as the babyface, he had his arm up and it was shaking and he was like, "Oh, I'm going to tap." And there was a ton of submissions in that match. And every second, that's what Jericho was doing. In this particular one, and I said that's the best way to sell submissions. But in this particular match, Brock Lesnar, it took him like 45 seconds to even put his arm up. Most of the time, he had both arms on the ground. He was prone and he was pushing himself up to try to move out of the sharpshooter. And the reason that works, the fans responded to that, because the reason it works is because Brock Lesnar from moment one has been put over as this monster, like this tough guy. Nobody can bring him down. Nobody, like, he barely feels pain. I want to say he barely sells, because he does in a very specific way, which we'll continue to get into. But as this goes on, the fans buy into how tough this guy is. And then after 45 seconds, that's when he puts his hand up, and so now what you've seen is over 45 seconds, this guy, he's screaming in pain, but you never think that he's going to tap out. And now once the hand's up, now you're like, oh, Rock's actually doing something to this guy. Maybe the match could end right here, because you've been in this thing for almost a minute now.
Yeah.
So and when Rock starts to sell submissions later on in the match, it's a lot different, and we'll get into that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because if a guy's waving their arms around for the whole submission, it kind of loses its potency. Like, he's waving his arm around 40 seconds into the submission the same way that he was 10 seconds. It doesn't really sell it. Whereas, as you've described, Brock Lesnar doing that at that point, it is noteworthy. So that's a great, and I actually think that's a really good almost summary of how Brock Lesnar sold against guys like Daniel Bryan and AJ Styles more recently.
Yes.
Like, when he was selling, it's a big deal. It's almost what's another good, like Suzuki or Ishii, or even the Miro DDT sell. It's almost impossible to hurt him, and then all of a sudden,
that one's going to live on.
He's going down type thing. So that's a really good
GWM lore for a long time. That Miro sell.
Where was I in my notes? Yeah, then there's some more interference. There's even a chair involved. So we just got cut off there. So we're going to be picking up the episode here. I was beginning to talk about how Brock Lesnar was beneficiary of Paul Heyman coming in with the chair, hitting The Rock with the chair, and then he was doing, there's a long kind of period of Brock Lesnar doing bear hugs to The Rock, which is one of those moves that can be really effective, and I think when Brock Lesnar does it, it's very, very effective. His history with Hogan there kind of helps that. Mark Henry was really good at putting them over for a while, but yeah, they can't get tepid bear hugs, just guys kind of hugging. But I think this works here. And Brock Lesnar doing 2 minutes of submission isn't really something that I would, associate with him at the moment.
It's so interesting about the way that Lesnar uses submissions in this match. So one of the things that I think was made very clear to these guys that they wanted to put Lesnar over as a shoot wrestler, but not by telling you, oh, this guy's a shoot wrestler, therefore he's better than everyone. They want to show you what that actually means. And so I've talked about this over on the Pro Wrestling Musings YouTube channel. I have a video about Ty Conti. It's one of our most popular videos, talking about why when you put someone over as a shooter in their style, people really respond to that. You don't have to tell anyone. You just have to put him over. Yeah. And that's what Lesnar does here. They put him over as a shooter, and he does that by all these submissions, not only the bear hugs, but also the grounded abdominal lock, the gator rolls, multiple pinning predicaments. I mean, it's shoot wrestler stuff. And the interesting thing is, you never think about Brock Lesnar as a submission guy, and he doesn't always use them. But in this particular match, if you were to extrapolate out, if we're talking per hour, which is how we compare wrestlers who haven't had equal match time, 497 seconds of submissions. If you were to put that in modern day AEW, that's where we have, that's our entire database of wrestlers for comparison. If you were to put Lesnar there, he would be near the top. I think he'd be in the top 5, if not the top 3, when it comes to submissions, and he'd be alongside guys like Danny Garcia, Angelico. I mean, that's that's the level he's at, and it's like the fact that he's able to do that, and the fact that Rock is able to sell it the way he does, it just puts over that this guy might never use a second of submission in any match that he's in, but if he does, it's still effective.
It's another wrinkle to his character, I suppose. You've got this huge guy that is big and strong, can throw you around, can hit you really hard, but then he can also do this. What is your tactic if you're like Kurt Angle and I'm going to bring the big guy down with submissions? Hold on, he's doing gator rolls and all these things. I think he had a run where he had a submission. They called it the Brock Lock for a bit.
Yes,
and it was like a single leg crab, but it was like around his neck.
Yeah, it was like a stretch muffler, but he didn't.
Yes.
He didn't actually stretch the abdomen. He just like lets you hang by your calf over his neck, and yeah, I mean, it's stuff like that. If he was doing arm bars and ankle locks and things like that, I think it would be a little less believable because like you say, a lot of people can do that, and it looks good when a lot of people do it. But I think for Lesnar for people to sell submissions that are, we consider generally only to be used for, true giants. You think of guys like Andre or Haystacks or guys like that use bear hugs, and Lesnar's doing it and guys sell it the way they are. I think that's what really puts it over the edge when it comes to people looking at Brock Lesnar and saying, wow, this guy, like he's truly dangerous in the submission game because he's doing these kinds of submissions and it's looking like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So by the time just after this point of the match, after Lesnar's submission spree, we're getting to around 9 minutes in.
Wait. Actually, I want to talk about one more thing when it comes to the submission, just because this is one of the things as a new wrestling fan. There are some things in wrestling that people say, this you got to suspend your disbelief too much, and this pulled me out of the experience. And one of those is the 3 arm drops for the submission. And I know a lot of people that just don't like that spot because they're like, oh, it's not realistic, it's not, and that's true, it's definitely not. But for me, that's just one of those things that it makes wrestling, and so Rock did that, and it was classic. He let the arms drop. He was dead. And then the third one, he catches it midway and fires up, gets out of the submission. I'm like, man, I understand it's not realistic, but it just brings you into the match. It you buy in because Rock he's firing up and the fans get behind him, which is actually something that Taz specifically says. Is he's saying he literally says these fans need to make a choice because they're getting behind Rock as he's getting up, and it's just it brought me into it. It's actually, I watched that and I'm like, you're telling me that The Rock became the biggest star in Hollywood? I totally believe that because he understands how people feel. He understands drama. He understands story. And that's what he did in that spot. Not everyone can pull that 3-arm drop spot off for me, but The Rock definitely did. And it was just one of those things in the match that it may not be realistic, but I loved it.
Cool. Yeah. And The Rock. So when we're getting to minute 9 after this big chunk of submissions, halfway through minute 9 is actually the first time in the match that The Rock has put together a sequence of over 3 moves. So there's a series of strikes. There's about 12 strikes from The Rock here. In the 5th minute, he hit a grapple and then he put Lesnar in the sharpshooter for 60 seconds. But then it's only in the 9th minute that he actually starts to hit. Oh, I'm telling a lie. In the 7th minute, he hits 4 strikes. Okay. In the 9th minute is the first time The Rock hits more than 4 moves or offense in a row. Brock Lesnar does that in the first minute of the match. He does it again in the 2nd minute of the match, and then he does it in the 3rd minute of the match. So The Rock hasn't been very on offense until the 9th minute, and there is a bit of a swing there that we'll start to talk about a bit later on. There's then some stuff outside the ring, and The Rock catapults, easy for me to say, Lesnar into the ring post. I have to say it's one of the coolest versions of that spot I've ever seen. I don't know if it's because Lesnar's so big, but I think it's probably more because Lesnar absolutely hurls himself into the air. Like, he's so high.
I am so glad you brought that up.
It's a really cool spot.
I was watching, I was thinking the same thing.
That taking off.
That sort of slingshot spot is, again, one of those that very often does not work for me because you see how much the guy selling it has to work to get up. You know, you basically have the guy who's doing the move, he just lies down, and the guy selling the move has to do all the work. And I'm like, okay, so you just threw yourself into that. But with Brock Lesnar, he's so athletic, and I don't think people say he's a great athlete, but I don't think people really understand just how good of an athlete he is, because it looked effortless. I mean, he's like, he doesn't even, his muscles don't tense. It literally looks like he got thrown, and then he jumps nearly over the ring post to sell this. I mean, his head hit near the top of the ring post, and it's just like, it's one of those things. And again, Brock Lesnar is my favorite wrestler of all time, and this is one of the reasons why, because you can do just little things, and he makes them look so much better. I don't think Brock has ever done a slingshot spot better than that one. I don't know if anyone's ever done a slingshot spot better than that one.
Yeah, nice. Get a bit of a smalls outside the ring after this. Heyman gets rock bottomed. The crowd love it. Lesnar then gets rock bottomed in the ring. There's a kick out. Then we have the 4th instance of Lesnar hitting a grapple to reverse. So I'm highlighting that because grapples are a really interesting kind of highlight for Lesnar. So there are 4 times during this match that The Rock starts to build some offense, and then Brock Lesnar kills it dead with a grapple. Often grapples are built up to in matches. You don't see a lot of reversals straight into grapples. There's usually some striking or something first. So that's really interesting, and it kind of shows what a big part of Lesnar's character, and especially in this match, grapples are. A bit more about that later on. There's a massive clothesline to block the people's elbow. That's a cool bit of the match. It's also a very important bit of the match. The Rock is pretty much in control from the 9th minute on. So that's kind of Lesnar's late comeback. Hits the F5, and people are really, really happy about heel Brock Lesnar beating babyface The Rock here.
It's such an important thing that I think when you watch the Ruthless Aggression documentary that WWE puts out, we all know that WWE content, they can stretch the truth a little bit.
Can they?
They've been known to at times.
Yeah.
And so if you hadn't watched this match, in that documentary, they say the fans they didn't turn on The Rock, but they certainly they certainly were 100% for Brock Lesnar by the end of this match, and the fans went nuts when he kicked out of the rock bottom, when he hit the F5, and when he won. The fans went crazy. And if you hadn't seen this match, they'd say that in the documentary, and you'd be like, come on, this is The Rock. I mean, there's no way that fans were that into Brock Lesnar, especially knowing what we know now. And you kind of have that mindset where you project backwards. And so you say, okay, well, now fans get kind of tired of Lesnar, so there's no way they reacted like that. And then you watch this match, and you're like, oh, yeah, they reacted like that. I mean, they were not – WWE was not over-exaggerating. I mean, the fans were 100% on Brock Lesnar's side, and they were going nuts for every spot in this match. And this is something else that we'll get into, but I think that was the design of this match. I think that was perfect. It's perfect evidence that The Rock and Brock Lesnar are, in my opinion, maybe the two most underrated workers in at least in the last 25 years, maybe in the history of wrestling, for things like this. And like I said, we'll get into it later, but I just want to put that in your mind, that that's part of the reason why I love this match so much. Also, by the way, can we talk about how brilliantly designed the F5 is as a finishing move for Brock Lesnar? Like this, it's one of those things. Great finishing moves, they have to have a combination of a couple different things. They have to be easily reversed or be so complicated to put together that it's very hard to get on. But then once it's on, it's on. They have to be impactful, and they have to be they have to have that kind of that thing that fans can really get involved in. So if you're talking about the worst finisher of all time, in my opinion, it's the overdrive or playmaker or whatever it's called. That has none of those things. It's somehow simple to put on and yet extremely complex. It has zero impact, and it doesn't have that kind of snap that the fans can really get into. The Stone Cold Stunner, on the other hand.
For people like me that can't picture that, what does the overdrive look like?
It's a setup like a Famouser. So MVP did it when it was called the Playmaker, and then I think Randy Orton was the one who called it the overdrive. So it's set up like a Famouser, where you put the guy's head under your knee, but then you grab his arm and then you twist it. So basically your opponent is taking a flat back bump, sort of, but then you're just DDTing yourself. Like you're giving yourself a face buster. And to me, it's the worst finishing move ever. Now, if you're talking about
picture how that
it's terrible.
Happens, so I'm assuming it doesn't make a huge amount of sense.
It really doesn't. It really doesn't. But if you're talking about the greatest moves ever, obviously the Stone Cold Stunner comes to mind.
Yeah.
And that has everything. It's simple, and yet it's easily reversible because it's so simple. It's impactful, and it has that snap, that moment when Austin's butt hits the ground. That's the snap. That's when everyone, and then it has that sell. The F5 has all those things, and it's brilliantly put together because it's Brock Lesnar, so it's anyone who he lifts up on his shoulders, and he's done it to everyone from Rob Van Dam to Rikishi, right? So he's done it to everybody, and the Big Show. He did it to the Big Show. So it's impressive looking because it's Brock Lesnar and he's getting guys up there. It's impactful because you're falling from that height and he's slamming you face first into the mat. But one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough is how at any point in the move it can be reversed. It can be reversed when he tries to put you on the shoulders. It can be reversed once you're on his shoulders, and it can be reversed when you're on your way down, which is what The Rock did in this one. Lesnar got him up and was smashing him down, and Rock landed on his feet. And to me, the only move that I've ever seen that is like that one is the One-Winged Angel. And it's that can be at any point during the move, it can be reversed. And that really, you cannot trust that move's going to get the job done until it's been hit. And that just every second, it makes every second of the F5 impactful because at any point this move might not go correctly. And that to me, again, when it comes to Brock Lesnar, it's so easy to just resign yourself to the fact that, yes, Brock Lesnar is going to win. And WWE doesn't help itself with the booking on that. But from a match standpoint, this match, every second you thought either The Rock or Brock Lesnar could win.
Absolutely. So if we kind of zoom out a little bit and we look at the match stats as a whole and what that kind of tells us about how this match is put together. So Interestingly, The Rock was using the just hit him approach. So the kind of hit lots of strikes, because if you try to do anything more complex, you are going to get murdered by Brock. We spoke about the grapples for Brock Lesnar, Griff, but The Rock also hit quite a lot of grapples. He hit 5, whereas Brock Lesnar hit 8. I found that quite surprising, looking at the numbers after the match. It didn't feel like The Rock was hitting grapples. What was your view on this?
I thought the same thing. I saw that, and I went back. I was like, where did those happen? With Brock, you can picture almost every one. But with The Rock, I'm like, when was he even able to get Lesnar up off his feet? And I think, again, it goes to the larger point of the match, which in my view, the point of this match was to pass the torch from The Rock, one of the biggest stars in the history of the WWE, to Brock Lesnar, who they believed at that time and then became, maybe not so much through their doing, but he did become one of the biggest stars in the history of the WWE, and that was the point of this match. And I think it just goes to show you that Brock's selling, it's you can get lost in the minutia when it comes to this. He doesn't no-sell, right? I mean, he does sell, but it's not the same as when Rock sells. I mean, Rock sells, and you're like, man, he's just been killed. But when Brock sells, it's almost like you're watching. You're not thinking about the move that just happened. You're thinking, is it finally time? Like, did he finally bring Lesnar down? I think that's why you don't really notice how many grapples The Rock is actually doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So this match is more than a quarter of this match is based around submissions. Mm-hmm. So 4 minutes out of the entire 15, almost 16 minutes of this match, one of the guys is in a submission hold. Yeah. Is that the best use of, The Rock, who's very impactful, a lot of strikes, a lot of flurries, Lesnar, big, strong, impactful. We've spoken about how Lesnar being able to do submissions is a really cool character trait. But does Brock Lesnar, should he be doing 131 seconds of submission and be in submission for 60 seconds? Is that good?
So generally speaking, I would say probably not. Mm-hmm. But in this particular match, it really worked for all the reasons that I said before about how you're trying to put Lesnar over as a shooter, and his submissions are so impactful that The Rock, when he sells them, you get people really invested in. I mean, when the grounded abdominal lock happened, and that was where we saw the 3 arm drop spots. Mm-hmm. The fans had turned on The Rock at that point. I mean, they were chanting "Rock, you suck" and stuff like that. During that spot, the fans got back involved because The Rock was selling in such a way that the fans are just trained to cheer for baby faces that are selling that way. And in large part, The Rock was one of the guys who sort of pioneered this kind of selling. And selling not just with, body movements, but with your facial expressions, right? I think Rock is the greatest of all time when it comes to that. And you could just see on his face, like he's got that pain, and he's got, it's like, it's the same. Hulk Hogan did it. I think Hulk pioneered it, and The Rock perfected it. That's the way I see it. Okay. And they needed that. They needed that spot because they needed the fans to be sort of on the fence up until that final moment. They needed the fans to still sort of want The Rock to win. Like, the way I see it is, the fans from moment one, they wanted Brock Lesnar to win, but they didn't want Rock to lose. And as the match went on, more and more fans started to actually want The Rock to lose, right? They wanted this moment to be the moment that Brock Lesnar was crowned champion, and by extension crowned the biggest star in the company. And that was Rock's goal. And during the submission spot, he brought fans back onto his side just so that later on in the match, he could turn them right back around and say, no, now it's time that you think Brock Lesnar is the biggest star in this company.
And what's interesting also about The Rock's performance is when we look at taunts, Lesnar only with 2, The Rock 7 during the match. That's quite cocky for a guy up against Brock Lesnar. So I wonder, is that like almost like a heel tactic almost? Is that an opportunity for the fans to turn on him a bit?
you know, this is such a weird match.
It is.
Just
it
in
is,
terms
actually.
of in terms of who you have, right? You have Brock Lesnar, who's a heel, but
Mhm.
he acts like a heel, but he's being cheered like a babyface. But then you have The
Yeah.
Rock, who's a babyface, but he's being cheered like a heel. Like
Mhm.
people are cheering for him, but they're cheering for him almost because he's a heel. Like it's very
Yeah.
odd, and it shouldn't have worked the way that it did. You could easily see fans turning on a match like this, and in fact, they really did. It was a similar thing when Brock took on Goldberg at WrestleMania 20, where it
Mhm.
was the
Yeah.
same. They had kind of ill-defined characters, and the fans just turned on that. But this one, they were totally into, and I think the taunts it is a microcosm of why the fans really liked this, because even
Mhm.
though these two guys have characters that on paper should not mesh in any way in a match like this, in reality, because these two guys had such defined characters, the fans knew who they were cheering for and they knew what they were
Mhm.
booing. And I think that's the most important thing. They knew they know who Rock is. And
Yeah.
The Rock he was The Rock this whole match. He never changed
Mhm.
anything. He never did anything different. The 7 taunts, I bet you that, what's that, 27 taunts per hour? I bet you that's less than half of what he normally does in a match. But it still seems like so much. And meanwhile, Lesnar, I mean, his taunts are almost just like they're not even taunts in the traditional sense. They're more just like
Mhm.
him flexing. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's like it because the fans knew who these guys were. When Rock taunts, the fans are trained to react a certain way, and when Lesnar does anything, the fans are trained to react a certain way. And it's only because these two guys have such well-defined characters. They don't have gimmicks. They're characters, right? I mean, Brock
Mhm.
Lesnar, I mean, that's his real name, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's how he fights, is just being Brock Lesnar. And then The Rock, obviously that's not his real name, but that's how everyone knows him, right? That's kind of just who he is. And because of that, you can make a match that doesn't seem to work, you can make it really work. And all just by having real characters that fans
Mhm.
know and have gotten behind for The Rock over a period of years, for Lesnar just over a period of a couple months.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. But what does make sense about this match is the kind of the percentages. Match offense, 55% to Lesnar. You would absolutely expect him to be dominating this match. What
Yep.
is more indicative of that is the big offense. Lesnar
Yes.
hit 63% of the total big offense in this match. So that's an awful lot more. And big
Yep.
offense is when we're talking about strike downs, grapples, dives, and sort of longer submissions. So it kind of eliminates simple strikes and very short, kind of, like 5-second submissions that don't really go anywhere. It just kind of highlights the things that are more impactful on TV and the things that tend to lead to wins a bit more. I did a bit of work on correlating which stats are linked to wins a year or so ago, and it was pretty apparent that just getting in a lot of strikes was almost unimportant or a hindrance to you, which when you look at this match, that kind of shakes out that way quite nicely.
The big offense is I'm so glad that you have added that to what we're talking about when it comes to stats. And I say it every time that we talk about it, because if there is one stat line that you can look at in the absence of everything else, just look at that one and say, I think I can tell you the story of this match just from this. It's the big offense.
Yeah.
Because you do realize how impactful some of these guys are, even though in a lot of instances, like in this one, The Rock had 12 more strikes than Lesnar did, right? Rock had 38 strikes, Lesnar had 26. And yet in the big offense, Lesnar was so far ahead. And it's because from moment one, the selling and everything about this match's design was to put over how powerful Brock Lesnar is. And in that big offense, it's right there for you. It's spelled out. Here's how much this guy is doing. Here's how much damage he's really doing. Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how much is he damaging his opponent.
Yes.
Strikes don't damage you that much. Strike downs damage you. Grapples damage you. All those things. And that's what we're really looking at. And Lesnar did a lot of damage in this match. And Rock sold it like he had done a lot of damage in this match. One of the things I mentioned for the reasons that I picked this match, that I think without realizing it, it set the template for a lot of what we now know as modern pro wrestling.
Okay.
And I think with stats, we're able to actually quantify that. And what I mean by that is when we look at AEW, which is that's the easiest point of comparison. It's what we all at PWF watch the most, and it's what we have all the stats for. When you look at AEW, a typical match between a big, giant, strong heel like a Brock Lesnar type and anyone else, the opponent tends to actually land more strikes. And it's actually something we talked about with Miro and Lee Johnson.
In my head, what you're talking about is kind of the Marco Stunt principle, because the famous Marco Stunt Lance Archer match, where Lance Archer essentially tried to launch Marco Stunt into the stratosphere, Marco Stunt actually got more of the match offense than Lance Archer, because every opportunity he got a chance, he'd windmill strike Lance Archer. So there's a point where he kind of like trips Lance Archer or something, and while Lance Archer's on his knee, Marco Stunt just hits him like 12 times in the back with, simple strikes. Lance Archer doesn't crumple to the ground or anything because he's Lance Archer being struck by Marco Stunt. And, he hits a few huge grapples. I think he choke slams him into the crowd or something at one point.
Yep, I think you're right.
But when you look at the match offense, it's Marco Stunt that's had more of it. And, obviously, if I put big offense to that match a year ago, 18 months ago, whenever it was, it would have told the story that I believe you're referring to, Griff.
Yes, exactly. I think Marco Stunt may not have had any big offense in that match. And
I would guess not.
Yeah. So I think, I'm not saying that people watch, Rock versus Lesnar at SummerSlam 2002 and say, I want to do a match like that. But I think on a general level, when you're telling the story of a big monster heel, the monster does not have to get a ton of offense. Now, in this particular one, Lesnar ended up with 55% of the match offense. A big part of that was the submission spot, which, as I said, had a wider storytelling purpose. But if you look at the last, almost the last half of this match, The Rock was pretty much on top up until the finish. So without that submission spot, The Rock would have had more offense than Lesnar. And I think what that went to is a wider understanding among people, either wrestlers or producers, that look and say, you know what? We don't have to constantly put over how big and strong this heel is by having him get a lot of offense, because just by virtue of their size, they do this. We see this in AEW with Nyla Rose. Nyla Rose almost never has most of the match offense, just because by virtue of her size, you're like, okay, well, she's a credible threat. So the whole match, we can work on making sure that the opponent is the one getting a lot of the offense so that we can sell that this heel might actually really be in trouble. And this match is the first one I can think of where that became really apparent. I'm not saying it's the first one that ever happened. I'm sure it's not, but it's the first one I can think of. I mean, Brock Lesnar is unique in all time among wrestling. The way he looks, his athleticism, his strength. I mean, all of that is unique. And so I think because of that, they were able to take a little bit of a risk. They were able to say, look, Brock Lesnar, just by virtue of who he is and how we've built him, he's dangerous just from the moment he walks out there. So let's look at this match as we're trying to convince fans for 15 minutes that The Rock can win this match. And really, when you look at when he hit the rock bottom, which isn't the most protected move in the history of wrestling, but it certainly was fairly well protected at the time, and Lesnar kicks out of the 2.9, at that moment, you wanted fans to believe that The Rock is winning this match. And then even after that, you want fans to believe that The Rock is winning this match until the moment when Brock Lesnar wins the match. And no matter what Brock had done, it's believable because he's Brock Lesnar, let alone the fact that he had just had, 25 big offense spots coming into that. So he had done a lot of damage. I just think so much of what we know as good modern pro wrestling, you can look at it and you can say, wow, this match actually had a lot of that in it. And I think a lot of people, this match goes underrated, I think, for that reason. A lot of people weren't realizing that that's really what you were seeing in this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to clarify, and this is just me making my process clear. The big offense, so that's the 5 strike downs plus the 8 grapples, which is 12. How do we then get to 25, Craig? Well, for big offense, I've been counting 10 seconds of submission as like one piece of big offense. So Brock Lesnar had a 32-second submission, so plus 3 for that. And then he had a 69-second submission, so plus 6 for that. And I believe that comes to 25. I really hope it does.
I think it does.
It does. I'm assuming it does. I'm very tired at this point of the evening. Don't have kids. Do have kids. It's wonderful. Okay, so so there's, if we move things along a bit and we look at the flow of offense, minute by minute totals, this is really cool because you can see the ebbs and flows of this match. Unsurprisingly, Brock Lesnar comes out hot. Big start from him. But after that, it ceased. They very much do seesaw. There's a big kind of Rock comeback, then Lesnar, then a couple of Rock spikes, and then Lesnar takes it at the end. Rock's simple strikes actually almost keep him afloat until minute 9, where he starts to get a bit more in. He does hit a few grapples before minute 9, but it's only ever one at a time. Brock has to actually make a comeback at the end, which is interesting. You know, Griff was speaking about how they were trying to convince you that The Rock could win this match. The Rock gets in a lot on Lesnar. You know, there's the catapult spot. He hits the rock bottom. He's hits another grapple. He's going for the people's elbow. Lesnar has to make a comeback, which, that's your big guy. That's your protected guy. That's interesting. And actually, The Rock has the advantage, so he gets more in than Lesnar for 8 out of the 7 minute by minutes. So if you actually count them on this graph, the Rock, that red line, is higher than the blue line of Brock Lesnar 8 times rather than the 7 for Lesnar, which sounds bizarre if you've watched the match, but it's the case. Perhaps that means that Lesnar's are more memorable, or Lesnar as a whole got more in, which he did. But yeah, the Rock did have his shine in this match. What do you make of that, Griff?
I think a big part of that is what we were saying earlier when it comes to big offense. One of the reasons why the big offense category, in my opinion, is so important is because it describes the offensive spots that we will remember after a match is done. But this graph, this is my absolute favorite thing that we do, the flow of offense. If you've listened to any of the podcasts, if you listen to the videos on YouTube, I talk incessantly about the flow of offense graph. And this is the reason why, because this takes into account all offense. And so even though after a match, any impactful offense you're thinking of, it's like 1 or 2 for The Rock and mostly for Brock Lesnar. Yeah. But really in the match, the story they're telling you is that The Rock is doing all these things. A lot of them are ineffective, but cumulatively, he's starting to wear Lesnar down. And Lesnar, I think one of the reasons why he is not just considered, he's a great monster. I think the reason why he's more than that is because he doesn't sell like a monster. Yeah, he does the wobbly, can you bring him down spot? That's fine. But he doesn't, it's not like a dichotomy between no selling and selling for Lesnar. There's a lot of minutia in there about how does he sell and what does he do? How does he sell for when, say, The Rock sends him into the ring post on a corner spear? How does he sell that versus how does he sell the spine buster from The Rock? Which, by the way, worst spine buster in wrestling. I have to say it. Someone has to say it. Someone has to say it. But look, Lesnar sold it, so I didn't mind. And then, yes, at the very end, you get Lesnar's spike because you get this trading of finishing moves. And then, Lesnar ends up taking it, and Lesnar gets the better of that one because after all of this match, after 15 minutes of this match, finally, when it comes down to it, these two men, after an absolute war for 45 seconds, they're on their feet, trading blows, trading attempts at their finisher, and Brock Lesnar comes out the better. So for all of there has been a little bit of nonsense in this match, right? And Lesnar hit him with a chair. Rock put Paul Heyman through the table. There were spots on the outside. So it's not like it was just, a straight grappling match in the middle of the ring, but you didn't need interference. You didn't need anything. All you needed was the last 45 seconds. Brock Lesnar is the better wrestler. And that's all there was to it.
Perfect. So moving things along, if we then look at the cumulative flow of offense, it's the exact same. All those peaks and troughs from the previous graph, they're just added together cumulatively rather than returning back to zero every minute. And we can see essentially how the buildup of damage affects each of the wrestlers. You can see that Lesnar's always ahead. He's always putting The Rock through more in this match. There's two important points for The Rock. Minute 5, he hits, that's minute 4. I'm talking nonsense. So minute 4 and then minute 5. Minute 5 is probably the more important one. Minute 5, he has the sharpshooter on. He also hits a grapple. Then in minute 9, The Rock starts to mount his offensive flurry that ends up with Brock Lesnar needing to make his comeback there at the end. And The Rock actually almost brings things back to evens in terms of the kind of cumulative offense that they hit on each other, only for Brock Lesnar to kind of shoot away there at the end as he makes his comeback and kind of takes the match, which I think this Griff actually does kind of, this graph is almost like a visual representation of what you were talking about in kind of Brock Lesnar's big and strong and he's over because of that, but they make you believe that The Rock can win this, and that's where we see these two lines almost coalescing. I believe that's what that word means, like coming together.
Yes, that is. Look, I'm not an English major, but yes. But
sounds
look,
right. Sounds right.
You are absolutely right about that. And one of the things about this is the reason why Lesnar stays on top is because they did the work very early on in the match to get Lesnar so much offense. So in the first 3 or 4 minutes, Lesnar's on top and it's not particularly close. And so from a cumulative perspective, Lesnar builds a massive lead. And if you can look at the 4-minute mark, Rock is like hanging out around 0 and Lesnar's almost near 50. So that is if you're talking about a sporting event, that is nearly insurmountable, that lead. But because it happened so early on, what they then progress to is a story throughout the next 10, 11 minutes where The Rock is, with a small exception for Lesnar's submission, The Rock is ahead. They did that work early on so that for the next 10 minutes, they can tell you a story about how The Rock is making a protracted babyface comeback. I mean, that's really what we're seeing, is just a babyface comeback that we're used to seeing over the course of like 45 seconds. We're now actually seeing it over the course of 10 minutes. And again, that keeps the fans invested because at every moment, Brock Lesnar remains as dangerous as he is at any given moment. You don't have to, again, persuade fans that he's dangerous. He just is. But The Rock, because they're doing this work, The Rock now looks minute by minute more and more likely to beat Brock Lesnar. And from a match standpoint, from a 16-minute match standpoint, the idea that at almost any point in this match, during submissions, during big spots, during spots on the outside, whatever the case may be, during those points, any man can win. And if we want to get into, I mean, just from a storytelling perspective, I think that's the case. But also, if you want to get into the wider, kind of fantasy booking aspect of it, to think, oh, well, The Rock is going to Hollywood, but this is Brock Lesnar. He's only been here for 3 months. If you want to start, working yourself that way, you also don't know who's going to win this match. There certainly was not an obvious winner here because Brock Lesnar is so young, because he is so inexperienced, and because it's The Rock. And so you're like, wow, are they really going to put this guy over on The Rock, like one of the biggest stars of all time? So even from that perspective, you don't know who's going to win. Every moment of this match, you're like, man, this could be the end. This could be the end of this match. And I love a good story. I love a good, not every match has to be like that. But my background as a sports fan, I love unpredictability. And that's what this match gave you every minute.
Absolutely. So now on to the good bit. So we're going to have a look at per hour rates. Per hour rates is important because it allows us to compare wrestling matches that are of different lengths. So it's really hard to compare a 30-minute match with a 15-minute match because both the wrestlers in the 30-minute match are going to get more strikes than the wrestlers in the 15-minute match. So, we need some kind of mechanism. If you look at a lot of sports, it'll be like, who's your top scorer? And it's like, oh, really interesting. He's your top scorer. But that guy might have played every minute of the season. And there's a guy that was injured for half of it who has better like per minute or per hour or per game stats. So like he's probably the better player, but he unfortunately got injured. So that's what we're kind of looking at. It's very important for wrestling because it's very rare that you end up with situations like the G1 where there's fixtures and they're all wrestling the same amount. But then again, even in the G1, the matches are all different lengths. So you have Toru Yano, who has, will end up at the end of the G1, will have wrestled for like 30 minutes total, whereas Kota Ibushi's wrestled for about 2 hours perhaps. So, you need to flatten those out.
Yep.
So, you can now be looking at the comparison if you are listening to this as a podcast and you've got the website up on your phone, or the link up on your phone, which will be in the show notes. I should really say that earlier on in the podcast, but I'm learning. Please don't criticize me too much. And if you're watching the video on YouTube, it will be right in front of you just now. So we have a slide with Brock Lesnar and The Rock compared with 3 other matches that are picked semi-randomly or semi because they're comparable. Omega Okada because it's one of the best matches ever. This is the shortest one because that's slightly more comparable to this. Steamboat Flair because it's from a completely different era and the timing is kind of similar to this. And then we've got The Rock Hogan for obvious reasons. Same company, same year. One of the competitors is the same too. One of the reasons that this match was so interesting to me was because, and as the listeners hopefully know, I've also done an episode with Mags of all of the podcast's fame about The Rock versus Hogan from WrestleMania that year, the kind of infamous match where The Rock had to severely alter his style during the match because of the reception Hogan was getting, which is actually very similar to this match. Like The Rock was not, he was the babyface in this match, kind of, and he was the babyface against Hogan, kind of. So, it's interesting. So we can kind of look here to see how their statistics in this match compare to other matches and other performances to kind of give them a bit of context. So, for example, when we look at strikes, it's a kind of a middling number of strikes, more than Okada and Omega per hour, similar to Steamboat Flair, but significantly less than what's arguably the most comparable match, The Rock versus Hogan. Are there any other numbers on this slide, Griff, that stand out to you as being particularly noteworthy?
The submissions, obviously. I think that's what jumps out to everyone, especially when you compare it to Steamboat versus Flair. When you think of Steamboat Flair, you can think of lots of different things, but one of the things that really comes to mind is the fact that both of these guys are tremendous mat workers. And even with Flair, that's not something that maybe it's not one of the things that comes up, but he certainly was. And Steamboat is one of the most, accomplished mat wrestlers in pro wrestling, probably of all time. Ric Flair's finisher is literally a submission, and yet Brock Lesnar is doing more submissions per hour than anyone, including Flair and Steamboat. And I think, again, it for me, who is a huge Lesnar fan, when you talk about greatest wrestlers ever, one of the things that certainly comes into the conversation is how many different stories can they tell in different matches. And for Lesnar to have submissions like this, and obviously, it takes 2 to tango. You need someone to sell it. The Rock was the guy in this particular match. I think it shows you how accomplished Brock Lesnar is. It shows you that for everything that he's about, for how big he is, for how impactful he is, for how hard he hits, this guy's background is as an amateur wrestler, and he was, let's not forget, an NCAA champion, a two-time NCAA national champion, and I think a four-time All-American as an amateur wrestler. So yes, he still has that in his back pocket, and yes, he can still do it, and yes, it still looks good, and he can do it with the best of them. He can do it with Flair. He can do it with Steamboat like they do it. And I just think, again, Lesnar is underrated, and that's one of the many numbers that can actually show you that, yes, Brock Lesnar is actually underrated.
Yeah, and at the risk of becoming unfocused, jumping around a little bit here, I've quickly dug up a couple Survivor Series matches that I did a couple of years ago. One, Daniel Bryan versus Brock Lesnar. In this match, Brock Lesnar hits 4 strikes, 9 grapples, and gets 41 seconds of submission in the whole match. Daniel Bryan, 31 strikes, 0 grapples, 3 dives, 47 seconds of submission. This is a 18, almost 19-minute match. So that's a very, very different style of offense from Lesnar. And that's more typical Lesnar, big grapple, big grapple, big grapple.
Yeah, however, that is Suplex City Lesnar right there.
Yes, absolutely. However, the year before, AJ Styles versus Brock Lesnar, 21 strikes, very great match. Although I prefer the Daniel Bryan one. I like Daniel Bryan's performance.
That's I can't argue with anyone who prefers either.
Brock Lesnar, AJ Styles, 21 strikes from Brock Lesnar in this match, 7 grapples, high grapples again, no dives, no submission in this match. AJ Styles, 21 strikes, exactly the same, 1 grapple, significantly less, 4 dives, 27 submission seconds. So again, it's another different style from Lesnar. And I think by this point of his career, Lesnar was getting criticized a lot about how he was working against certain guys. I mean, I think it's well known that he was a bit fed up, and it depended who his opponent was for what you were going to get from him. The other thing that I noticed from going back to the comparison slide, the other thing that I noticed was Lesnar's pin attempts, which is very high compared to The Rock's, which is very low, but it's also high compared to everybody else on the slide except for Ric Flair, who did an absurd amount of pin attempts during his entire feud with Steamboat. And on the flip side, the other thing that was really interesting was the aforementioned Rock's taunts. Huge amount of taunts there, only outdone by the Rock and Hogan match, where both of them did loads of, but that was a very kind of crowd kind of interaction type
exactly
match.
That was a crowd popping kind of thing. One of the things you brought up the Lesnar pin attempts, and I'm really glad you did. One of the things that I noticed early on, when you think about pinning in wrestling matches, there's a general sort of flow that those things tend to follow. So if you think about a typical wrestling match, your first pin attempts are ineffective. Like they're either 0 counts or they're 1 counts. Then you hit a signature move or you hit a flurry of moves and you get a 2 count. Then maybe you hit a signature move or even a finisher and you get a 2.9. And then you do that maybe a couple times and then you get your 3. This match from early on, at no point did Rock ever kick out before 2. From the very first pin of the match, which was after a belly-to-belly suplex, it was the first move of Brock Lesnar, got a 2 count on The Rock. And it's like from moment one, they're telling you what the story is, right? They're saying from the first pin attempt of the match that Brock Lesnar is bigger and stronger than The Rock, and he can hurt this guy. Everything he does can hurt this guy. And that's the story that you're being told. And so Lesnar is constantly pinning, not out of arrogance as a heel, because that's what Ric Flair was doing, right? Flair had 44 pins per hour in that match. A big reason for that is because he's arrogant. He just pins guys over and over, and that's how he gets heat. Lesnar's not doing that out of arrogance. He's not doing it for heat. He's doing it because each time he could potentially win that match. Yeah. And they're telling you that from the first spot. And so again, it's so much of a different story than we're used to seeing. And yet it's a story that maybe that's why this match resonates so much with me, because I am such a big fan of sports, is that's a story that you're used to seeing in a sporting arena, is that every time, especially when it comes to boxing, right? When you're going against a big hitter, Every time he throws a punch, you're thinking, oh, that could be it. I mean, if that connects right, you're done. And that's exactly the story they're telling you with Brock Lesnar.
And the grapples is the other thing that for me is jumping out. You're talking, he's the big hitter. Well, those pins that you're talking about, and you've described it perfectly, are often after grapples. In this match, there are 1, 2, sorry, just a second, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 instances of Lesnar hitting a grapple and then immediately going for a pin, which, you know, that's a fair amount in a 15-minute match. Those grapples jump out of this page as well as being significant. 30 grapples an hour from Lesnar is more than almost every other competitor. It's even more than Kazuchika Okada, who, you know, you'd think that New Japan wrestlers would be, you know, right up there. And Kenny Omega's the only guy on this slide with more than Lesnar. That's perhaps quite a highlight of how many grapples that Omega hits. But you know what, huge for Lesnar.
You know what? When I'm looking at this, so Brock Lesnar is my favorite wrestler of all time. A close second is Kenny Omega. And when you look at this, when you look at
grapples,
I think that's what I'm realizing. I think that what these two guys have in common is that everything they do is impactful. It's designed to move the match forward, right? It's not just about hitting hard for the sake of hitting hard. It's about how do you keep this match going towards its inevitable conclusion. And Brock Lesnar did that because when you look at 30 grapples an hour, 27 pin attempts an hour, they tend to mirror each other. His grapples are strong and dangerous, and he pins, like you said, after so many of them. And so every time you see him grapple, you're thinking this could be the end of a match.
Yeah.
Kenny Omega, 37 grapples an hour, 24 pin attempts an hour, a little bit more disconnected, but still within that range of saying when Omega hits a grapple, what you're designed to think, what he wants you to think is this match might be coming to an end. And it's very similar. Brock Lesnar has certain grapples, certain signature moves, if you will, that often don't end matches, but are designed to tell you the story that this match could be ending. So Suplex City is a perfect example. You know, any of his suplexes, but specifically his German suplexes. You know, he has those things, triple power bombs that like he does, and the whole point is, oh, this match could be over. Kenny Omega has the same thing. You know, whether it's Snapdragon, whether it's the Kotaro Crusher, whatever it may be from him, he's got those moves that are impactful, that people love, and you're like, man, this match could be over.
And he's also up there for pin attempts as well. He's got less than Steamboat and Flair, but that match they ended up trading those quite a lot. Out with Steamboat and Flair, the only other guy that's got more pin attempts per hour on this slide is Lesnar. Yep.
And it's very similar in terms of the number. And really, from, you know, Omega and Okada, those are some of my favorite matches of all time. I know that's a really hot take, but you know, I got to come out and say it.
It's for a reason, though. It's for a reason.
Exactly. And when you look at these two matches that are most comparable in terms of length, they are actually fairly similar. So Kenny Omega is the heel, like Brock Lesnar is the heel, but in both cases, both guys are getting cheered by the fans, right? Both guys are kind of new in a sense. I mean, Lesnar's much newer than Omega, but new in the sense that they're being presented as truly world championship material. And fans are really starting to get behind that. The story is, yes, they're heels, but that's sort of the point. Like, people love the heelish stick, and for both men, that's the case. So for both men, their opponents outstrike them. In the case of Omega and Okada had more strike downs as well, but I think that's more to do with Okada and the kind of wrestler he was.
He gets a lot of strike downs in general. Okada, he's quite up there for that one.
Yes, exactly. So I think that is, you know, going off its own thing. And Okada still is meant to be champion for more time. So that's the other thing you got to keep in mind. But when it comes to grapples, both Omega and Lesnar far outdoing their opponent. When it comes to submissions, both Omega and Lesnar far outdoing their opponent. And they're both facing an opponent that sells submissions exceptionally well. So those spots really mean something. Those seconds of submission, it's not just rest holds. It's really designed to be telling you a story as that match goes on. When you get to reversals, in both matches, both wrestlers were exactly equal. And so what you are telling me with that story is both guys are very skilled when it comes to the actual mechanics of professional wrestling, because that's what a reversal comes down to. How skilled are you in getting out of these moves? And the story you're telling me both times is that they're very skilled. When it comes to fouls is the one thing, again, where it sort of deviates, but I think that has more to do with Paul Heyman than anything else. And then when it comes to taunts as well, Kenny Omega, that was his thing. And Okada never taunts at all. But again, it's all about telling you a story. In this case, Omega's the one taunting a lot, and that's what is supposed to get the fans reacting certain ways. In Rock versus Lesnar, The Rock taunts a lot, and that's what's supposed to get fans reacting in certain ways. And in both cases, what it comes down to at the end of the day is one finisher, in both cases a very protected finisher, and you get the fans that now, in Lesnar's case, he's champion and the fans are behind it. In Omega's case, he's going to be champion in just a matter of months. And the idea is the fans need to get behind it, and eventually they did, of course. And I think both these guys, it's so funny because it seems like they shouldn't have any similarities at all. But I think on a base level, I think both Lesnar and Omega approach pro wrestling the same way. I think they approach their matches the same way. And I think really the only difference is Omega ended up in a place where he was allowed to tell his own stories and be his own character. And Lesnar ended up in a place that booked him, to just be, unbeatable, undefeatable. Yeah. And that started to work against him because it started to come back on him. To me, this 2002 Lesnar is the purest form of why Brock Lesnar is the person he is, why he's such a star the way he is. And I think if Lesnar had ended up in New Japan, obviously he did, but that was under much different circumstances. If he was in New Japan in 2002, I think you'd be seeing very similar, Brock Lesnar and Kenny Omega. I know it's a little bit of a hot take, but that's when I'm looking at these numbers, that's how I feel about it.
That's the kind of conclusion I've come to, that out of all those guys on that slide, they are the two that are most comparable. Okay.
So interesting. It's so unexpected.
It is. I only threw this particular slide into the podcast at the last minute. I've done this slide in all of the podcasts, but it was a kind of a last minute rush before the first one that I did, and I'm really glad that I did, because I find this one the most interesting to talk about.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah, right. So we're about to finish up. I'm going to throw a bunch of questions at you, Griff, and you can maybe choose one to answer. So how special is that 5 months before the title win, like that time scale to put somebody over? Or we can go with what's the closest thing to Lesnar? How would you define Lesnar's legacy, or do we need more booking akin to Lesnar's at this kind of time?
Okay. Well, the good thing about that is one of those one of those questions I've already kind of answered, because Lesnar and Omega I think are very very similar. Yeah. So I got that one out of the way. I'm going to give a one-word answer to how special that 5-month period was. Very. Yeah. The question that I think is actually most interesting is the lasting legacy of Brock Lesnar. Because I think when it comes to should we book more matches like this, the answer is yes, we already are. If you look at AEW, a lot of their matches look like this. And I think that's not a coincidence that I love AEW. I watch the product. I watch it every week. I've never missed a second of AEW TV. And this right here is one of my favorite matches of all time. I don't think that's a coincidence. As far as the legacy of Brock Lesnar, it is a very complicated one. I think, and it's complicated for a lot of reasons. I think it's complicated because he's been involved in a lot of different sports. right? He's done amateur wrestling, he's done pro wrestling, he's done MMA, he's done football. So he's been involved in a lot of different things. I think he's been involved in a couple different controversies, specifically when it comes to steroids. That's been bandied around his entire career, really. And obviously he did pop on a drug test once, much later, when he was due to fight Mark Hunt ahead of UFC 200. So I think that comes into it. And I think the way he's booked in WWE comes into it, because it's so hard to put booking, to sort of lay that aside from the wrestler that you're talking about. So often people say, oh, I'm tired of Brock Lesnar. But really what you're tired of is the way Brock Lesnar is booked. And I'm tired of that too. But I think the legacy, what we're going to think of when it comes to Brock Lesnar is we're going to think of, one, I hope people really take a look and say, you know what, this guy's one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. I really, really believe that if you're talking greatest ever, I think Lesnar belongs in that conversation. Is he the greatest ever? Actually, in my opinion, the greatest ever is Kenny Omega. But I think if you're talking about that conversation, I think Lesnar belongs there. And I think this match is a perfect indication of why he belongs there, because Lesnar can work at an incredibly high level. And that's what I think a lot of people don't give him enough credit for, is the things that he does. He works at such a high level. The things that he thinks about, the psychology that happens in his matches, it's not easy to do. He makes it look easy. He punishes himself because he makes things look so easy, but they're really not. Not many people can do the kinds of things that he does. And so I really think the legacy is a guy who was a transcendent star who didn't really want to be a transcendent star. Yeah. Right. That star power sort of snuck up on him. And he was like, you know what? That's not really what I want to do. He was blessed with all of these physical gifts, and he used them to become one of the biggest stars in the industry, and really one of the biggest stars in sports. I mean, I knew who Brock Lesnar was when I wasn't watching wrestling at all. In fact, the one wrestling match I even came close to watching, I ended up not doing it, but the one wrestling match that I would have watched before I became a wrestling fan was Brock Lesnar versus The Undertaker. And so it's like he brings so many people into the concept of pro wrestling, and he brings so many pro wrestling fans into this idea that you don't have to be put in a box, right? Lesnar is an incredible athlete, but he's so big and he's so strong, and in this match he wasn't working like you'd expect. And I think moving forward, you have a lot of wrestlers that don't work the way you'd expect them to. They don't work just because they're built a certain way, or they have a certain background. They actually are allowed to develop their own in-ring style, and that's Lesnar's probably one of the last in WWE who really was allowed to do that. And so I really think long-term people will look back and say Lesnar is one of the greatest of all time. Lesnar is, in my opinion, possibly the greatest athlete of this generation. And I think he will be a guy that people say, you know what, he was booked poorly in a lot of instances, but if you just want a guy to make someone a star, to give someone a great match, if he's allowed to, and obviously if he wants to, that's a piece of it as well. But really, if he's allowed to do it, and if he wants to make a star, he can. And there are a lot of guys that you can trace real star power back to a match with Brock Lesnar. And I think as a wrestler, that's all you could ask for a guy to do, is be a star when you're winning and make a star when you're losing. And I think that's what Brock Lesnar has been about.
Yeah, and for me personally, when I think back to things in the WWE that I have actually enjoyed out with NXT over the last kind of 2-3 years, quite a few of them is Brock Lesnar. I really enjoyed the Royal Rumble match where he just essentially had a bit of a laugh and kind of eliminated half of them. And those Survivor Series matches with Styles, the Bryan Danielson one, I absolutely loved. But also there's a match, I think it's at the Royal Rumble, against Finn Balor, which is a really, really good match. And it's just like the threat that he brings to his match and the kind of the urgency and the kind of the urgency and focus that he brings out of his opponents, like Balor, Styles, Daniel Bryan. They were all like whenever they eked out that opportunity, they were going for it like their life depended on it. And I think I think in the WWE especially, where they've kind of sucked that feeling out of essentially everything now. And I mean, you could argue even the Brock Lesnar matches as well. They're just F5, F5, F5 now, which is
tend to be
which is kind of awful. But the matches against some of the smaller guys that he wanted to have a good match against are, they're about as memorable as anything that company does.
I would absolutely agree with that, and I think Lesnar, he's one of the things that I find most impressive about him is the fact that when you listen to him talk, he's a pretty humble guy, and he doesn't really every time I've listened to him, he doesn't really come off as like he's gonna big time you if he sees you and stuff like that. It doesn't really come off like that. But I think the key to humility is not denying that you have anything special. It's understanding that you do have something special and not asking people to acknowledge that. And I think that is Brock Lesnar as a wrestler in a nutshell, because he understands that the littlest things that he does will make a big impact. And you mentioned the Royal Rumble match. One of my favorite spots in there is just the way Lesnar reacts to Keith Lee walking to the ring.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
It's like, and I said it at the time, I'm like, in that moment, they didn't touch each other. And in that moment, Keith Lee became a bigger star because Brock Lesnar just reacted the way he did. And I'm like, that's a guy who understands what he's about. He understands, what he can do just by the way he looks at someone. And, again, the thing I keep coming back to is, as a wrestler, be a star as a winner and make a star as a loser. And Brock Lesnar was a star for halfway through that Royal Rumble. And then the moment he got Claymore over the top rope, he made a star. Drew McIntyre became the biggest star in WWE because of that. And that is, to me, I'm like, I can't think of a better use of a pro wrestler than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think that pretty much wraps it up, Griff. Would you like to tell the people where they can find you?
Oh, I've heard that line before.
Yeah, it just came to me, and I really didn't mean to do that on purpose. And then it was like, oh, that's Griff's line, and then I just started saying it. So there we go. We're canon.
You know what? That's fair enough. I like that. That's the gimmick now for any podcast we do for PWM. You can find me on my personal YouTube channel, General Admission Wrestling. And look, while you're there, if you're not already, subscribe to the Pro Wrestling Musings YouTube channel. If that's not where you're listening to this, we always have great stuff happening. And you can actually watch along as we talk about these numbers, which is you don't realize how invaluable that is till you actually do it. So go subscribe and watch all these podcasts with the numbers that we're talking about.
Thank you very much. If you're looking for anything more like this, please head over to prowrestlingmusing.com. An endless treasure trove of match reviews and stuff.
I'll say
stats and etc. Lots of cool people doing some writing as well. Thank you very much for listening to us, and I hope you will do so again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.